Alexander Fleming, a Scottish researcher, is credited with the discovery of penicillin in 1928, but the first antibiotic was actually discovered by accident. It was often said that Fleming was a careless technician. While experimenting with the influenza virus in London, he returned from a 2-week-long vacation back to the laboratory. Fleming returned to find that mold had developed on an accidentally contaminated Staphylococcus culture plate. Upon examination of the mold, he noticed that the culture prevented the growth of staphylococci. Fleming continued to test and do experiments to understand why the new mold had stopped the growth of Staphylococcus. It turned out that the mold was releasing a compound that could kill bacteria in an attempt to have more space to grow and more nutrients to itself. In an article, Fleming described the colony as a fluffy white mass which rapidly increased in size and after a few days sporulates and changes color from dark green to black to bright yellow. Fleming also said, "One sometimes finds what one is not looking for. When I woke up at dawn at September 28, 1928, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic or bacteria killer, but I guess that's exactly what I did." Though penicillin would eventually be used to cure everything from blood poisoning, from minor injuries to pneumonia to rheumatic fever, Fleming's 1929 published study focused mainly on the antibiotic's possible utility for bacteriologists. Penicillin made a difference during the first half of the 20th century. The first patient was successfully treated for Staphylococcus septima in the United States in 1942. However, supply was limited and demand was high in the early days of penicillin. Penicillin helped reduce the number of deaths and amputations of troops during World War II. According to records, there were only 400 million units of penicillin available during the first 5 months of 1943. By the time World War II ended, U.S. companies were making 650 billion units a month.
So what we have here is the basic structure of a molecule of penicillin. It consists of 16 carbons, 18 hydrogens, 2 nitrogens, and 1 sulfur. The R on the left of the molecule represents the side chain that differentiates distinct penicillins from one another. The group being boxed right now is in an acyl group, which is essentially responsible for killing gram-negative bacteria that contains an additional outer membrane. The beta-lactam ring, however, kills off gram-positive bacteria due to its specific structure that we will look at more closely in just a moment. Fused to the right of the beta-lactam ring is a 5-membered ring known as the thiazolidine ring, which helps support the reactiveness of the beta-lactam ring. The beta-lactam ring consists of an amide functional group, a double-bonded oxygen, and 3 carbons. This ring is the main component of penicillin that is responsible for killing gram-positive bacteria. As shown here, the rings appear to be in the formation of a square. However, the hybridization of the carbons differ from one another. The top 2 carbons have an sp3 hybridization, while the bottom carbon has a hybridization of sp2. This causes an imbalance between the angles that form and puts a lot of tension on the ring. Eventually, the bond between the bottom carbon and the nitrogen breaks, and it is this broken bond that then supports penicillin's antibacterial activity. Now, penicillin is considered an irreversible enzyme inhibitor, which essentially means that it is a molecule that binds to an enzyme and limits or stops its activity. If we consider a gram-positive bacterial cell, there is a cell membrane that protects the inside. What is referred to as the building block of this membrane is known as peptidoglycan. Peptidoglycan is a polymer consisting of sugars and amino acids that not only provides a strong structure for the outside of the bacterial cell, but assists in binary fission, which is how bacteria reproduce. In order for bacteria to multiply, the cell membrane is continuously broken and therefore needs to be repaired. This is where the enzyme DD transpeptidase comes into play. DD transpeptidase cross-links the peptidoglycan so that there are no longer any holes or breaks in the cell membrane. Therefore, the beta-lactam ring, which now contains an unbonded carbon, attaches to the DD transpeptidase enzyme that it inhibits, destroying the makeup of the bacteria's cell membrane. This eases the tension within the ring and gives the nitrogen a negative formal charge. The bacteria cell, however, cannot repair its membrane without the assistance of the DD transpeptidase and begins to flood. Eventually, the cell bursts and penicillin successfully kills the gram-positive bacteria.
Penicillin is the most common allergy in the United States, with 10% of the population allergic to the drug. The allergy occurs when a person's immune system becomes overly sensitive and overreacts as if penicillin itself were an infection. If the body sees penicillin as a threat, it develops an antibody to fight it, and the symptoms caused by the antibiotic fighting penicillin are very similar to those of most allergic reactions: hives, itching, fever, runny nose, watery eyes, and anaphylaxis.
Well, I used to be allergic to it, so when I was born, they were giving it to me to try to so that I could form heart valves and stuff. And then I had an allergic reaction and I started swelling up.
"17 years after the discovery of penicillin in 1945, Alexander Fleming said that the public will demand the drug and then will begin an era of abuses. Penicillin has saved millions of lives over its decades of use, but Fleming correctly said that overuse of antibiotics creates huge problems. You may have heard about the problem in the context of more recent cases, but it actually started back in Fleming's time. In 1940, scientists discovered a strain of E. coli that could produce an enzyme called penicillinase that could disable penicillin from killing the bacteria like it normally would. 2 years later, hospitals found 4 strains of Staphylococcus aureus that were also resistant to penicillin. These strains continued to spread without interference because there was no medication at the time that could stop them. In the 1960s, methicillin, another antibiotic, was synthesized and treated Staphylococcus aureus, but after 20 years, 29% of the Staphylococcus aureus cases in the United States hospitals were resistant to methicillin too. Over 150 different antibiotics have been discovered and put into use since penicillin, and the majority have some strain of bacteria become resistant to them. Strains that become more and more resistant to different and stronger antibiotics are called superbugs and are considered a large risk to public health. Antibiotics have no effect, so there are few options for a course of treatment as these strains spread throughout the population. There are initiatives now to reduce antibiotic use, except where it is actually medically necessary to prevent bacteria from forming resistance when a person does not really need antibiotics. So, how has penicillin changed the world? Infections that previously would have resulted in death are now easily treatable with a penicillin shot or oral antibiotics where they're available. Before penicillin, the smallest cut could become infected and that infection could become fatal. People could die from slicing their finger, working on a farm, or like we saw in the case of Albert Alexander, tripping into a rose bush. Now, even a large wound has greatly reduced risk for fatal infection as long as it is kept clean and the wounded person takes antibiotics. In the United States in 1928, respiratory infections like pneumonia and tuberculosis caused 18% of all deaths. Now, those diseases are treated with a round of antibiotics, and the risk of death for a healthy adult is quite low. Hospitals today depend very heavily on antibiotics. Globally, 10% of maternal deaths are caused by bacterial infection that antibiotics could treat. Surgeries, especially those that place a foreign object in the body, like the placement of a pacemaker or a shunt in the heart, rely on antibiotics to prevent infection. Patients in the intensive care unit with injuries like burns, as well as people who have undergone radiation or chemotherapy, can become immunosuppressed, meaning their bodies do not fight off infection as readily. They also rely on antibiotics to prevent infection from worsening their illness. It's estimated that penicillin has saved 200 million lives over the past near century, but as we continue to save lives with it, we have to be aware of a larger problem of antibiotic resistance.
Penicillin.
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 Penicillin!
Penicillin.
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 Penicillin. Penicillin.